This is Red Ice Radio. From the visible to the obscure. RedIceCreations.com.
Welcome friends, listeners and members. This is Red Ice Radio. My name is Henrik Palmgren. We are coming to you from the land of the Goths on the Scandinavian peninsula. It's good to have you with us today. Thank you for tuning in wherever you are around the planet. Follow us on RedIceCreations.com for regularly updated news and commercial-free radio on some of the most vital issues. We entertain ideas, listen to different perspectives, and present material that hopefully will help you to come to a better understanding of the world and what really is going on. We encourage you to always come to your own conclusions, and we never ask you to believe anything. Subscribe to our Twitter and RSS feeds. Find us on Facebook and YouTube. Sign up for our newsletter and let our news and latest radio programs come directly to you. All the links are up on RedIceCreations.com. Author, strategist, inventor, and software architect Frank O'Collins is with us today to talk about his work with UCADIA. Frank is a world-recognized author and futurist, having developed over 60 websites on global issues and solutions, having received letters of support from dozens of world leaders over the years. Educated and receiving his higher school certificate at the Jesuit Xavier College in Kew, Melbourne in 1982. Frank deferred a music or arts degree at La Trobe University to firstly pursue a rock and roll career, and then a 2-year reflection on whether to join the priesthood, spending time at the Capuchin Seminary in Sydney and volunteering at a homeless shelter in Melbourne. Frank started collecting and working on the ideas that eventually became UCADIA more than 25 years ago, as far back as in 1986. The idea that the universe is a dream, but the dream has rules. However, since then, Frank has completed a range of books, patents, and models covering a vast area of subjects that can be found on UCADIA.com and other sites such as oneheaven.org. Frank's current focus is finishing the 22 books of Canons of Law, based on a Restore the Law project, aimed at challenging the root of Roman Vatican law, 500 years since Martin Luther first challenged the authority of the Vatican and its commercial allies. He's also working on the rollout of local community-based charters and self-sufficient financial systems to help people take control of their own energy and protect themselves against the future shock of continued global financial meltdown. Stay with us as we discuss law, sovereignty, the Roman cult, the history of the Venetians / Khazarians, and other related global issues. This is going to be a really interesting program. We have Frank O'Collins with us here. It's great to have you with us, Frank. How are you today?
I'm very well, Henrik. Thank you very much for inviting me.
You bet. Your name has come up now and then with some of our previous guests. This is a big theme, of course, that we've been having in the background since we pretty much started in terms of the law system, specifically studying history from the perspective of the Roman system, or the Roman cult, as it were. I'm very interested in this topic, and it's such an important one, obviously, that always is pertinent to why things are the way they are in our world. And your name has come up in reference to this many times. It's great to finally have you with us, as I said. Why don't you tell us a little bit about UCADIA first, and some of the things that you've been working on throughout the years, Frank?
Sure, absolutely. Well, look, let me start by actually what UCADIA means. The word UCADIA came about from two things. It means unique collective awareness, so UCA, and then DIA. And DIA is a building block of meaning, a symbolic structure of meaning that came about from designing a collection of ideas and finding a way. Could I strip away the labels to ideas? Could I strip away the kind of orthodoxy that goes with knowledge, which gets entrenched in religions or gets entrenched in universities? And when I stripped that out, what I wanted to do was I wanted to say and see, was there a way to look at knowledge in a generic model sense? In other words, I wanted to know, was there a model that gave me meaning to life, which is something I needed in my life at the time, as well as meaning to the spiritual side, without having to come to it as an act of faith or an act of blind belief. And so dias became the building blocks, like sentences, to ideas, and then ideas became the building blocks to models. So I selected this word UCADIA because UCA, unique collective awareness, was a generic description rather than saying God or creator, and then dia was this building block. And I chose that in the spirit of what UCADIA is and what I've been doing with UCADIA. UCADIA is a model. It's a big model, but it is still a model. It's a model of ideas that says it is possible to present an alternative to the Roman system, to the global Roman financial system, Venetian financial system, to the legal system, the Venetian, Roman, Jesuit legal system, and to the industrial system that largely treats us as worker bees, as slaves. And that's really why I selected the word, and that's what UCADIA is. UCADIA is a model, albeit an extremely large model.
Now, did you personally start out in the aspect of the law specifically, or did you come to this from the point of view of, I guess, a more philosophical concept of trying to create this model, as you mentioned, Frank?
Well, it came from and I'll tell you the background, because I think I would like to share the background. It came from a very personal and very deep background where I'd grown up in a family with great privilege, not enormous wealth, but certainly upper middle class. And I'd gone to a good private school, a Jesuit private school, and the family had always had connections into the Catholic Church and into law. My great-grandfather in Australia was the Attorney General of Australia for a time, and my grandfather was one of the greatest barristers of law in Australia. So all this background was there. And I had been in a financial position where I'd fallen from a great height. And it was justified. I mean, I had done silly things. I hadn't done anything unlawful. I had merely acted in an unprofessional manner and allowed people to put me in a position of exposure. So I lost everything. And I was at a position, I said, what is the purpose then of my life? I had spent years in politics in Canberra, which is the capital here in Australia, and I had spent even time in a Capuchin monastery thinking of whether I'd be a priest. I had spent time in business, and I had all this experience and all this incredible experience and opportunity. But I really had never asked the hard question, is there truly a purpose? Or am I just kidding myself? Am I just living my life day to day based on the coattails of my family? And when I asked that question and I started to write it down, I wrote what I wrote down without any agenda. I had made a promise at that time that whatever I wrote, I would never do it to make myself famous or to become a guru or to become messianic. I promised that I would walk away from this knowledge, but I would be truthful to it. And so began a journey where I went on a philosophical journey of understanding, is there a connection to the world? Is there something that brings together the material world, the physical world, the scientific world, and the spiritual world? And then I discovered that this was a well-worn path. Krishnamurti, Buddha, Yeshua, Jesus, Muhammad, many, many people had given us insights to show that the two are the one, that life is a dream, but a dream has rules. And so when I started to write this down, that's where I came from. I came from that perspective. And it was only when I'd finished it and I started to look at the fact that everything around me is a model. Our government is a model. We live in square prison block buildings because someone invented that idea. Someone promoted that idea. We wear suits and strangle our neck with a tie because someone came up with that idea. That's a model. So only when I'd finished the kind of philosophical did the law come after that. And so the law part of this has really only been in the last 10 years, but the journey's been for 25 years.
Well, exactly. I mean, and that's an area that at one point or another you're kind of forced to go into if you want to understand some of the problems, if you will, in our world, and maybe why, to some extent, individually, we might be in a mess, if you will. Because, as you say, we live in a world of ideas, and these ideas have been, in many cases, shaped by other people. It's been shaped by people who lived, in some cases, thousands of years ago. And an interesting aspect, when going through some of your material, Frank, and looking into some of the things about, the trustee, the grantor, beneficiary, some, as you kind of begin to unravel and understand the system that we live in. One idea that I always come back to is where the Roman cult, where some of these people, and if you will, them philosophers behind this system, where they got their ideas from. And if you think that this is actually based on something true, maybe not empirical from a scientific point of view, but something that they truly believe in, because this is, at the end of the day, it's at least on the surface about their claim to connectivity to the God that they believe in. Correct? Absolutely.
Well, look, there's a saying I say that really it's an understanding that comes from the time of the Egyptians and the Ixos, or sometimes called the Hyksos, at the real kind of high point of the occult black magic of the ancient Egyptian reign. So the times prior to Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, before the Ramses destroyed Egypt. And it's a saying, to name a thing for what it is to take its power. To name a thing for what it is to take its power. So that knowledge, specific knowledge, has always been regarded as something of the utmost value. And it's why the analogy of treasure and calling knowledge treasure and mixing it up has been so prevalent in the ruling elite's mystique for thousands of years. So, yes, in their mind and in their belief structure, and I do believe there is a provenance, a history that you can trace, like an artwork or anything of value. You can trace back and see the footprints or the handprints of each previous author, master, group, if you like, back to points of origin. That I believe that knowledge is their most precious. And if you're going to understand the world, indeed, if you're going to change the world, then you need to step not only into their shoes and see it as they see it today, but see it as they saw it 70 years ago, 120 years ago, 300 years ago, 500 years ago. And when you see that, the knowledge that you can then view is real power. And with that power, you can start to affect change. And that's a very important part of how UCADIA has evolved, particularly with sites like one-evil.org, sites like One Heaven and the Law, which hopefully we'll talk about.
Absolutely. We'll definitely get those out and talk more about some of the things that you would detail on those websites and the different aspects of it that you've been branching off to. And I like that concept as well, Frank, in terms of the fact that this is a continuous process. It's about growth, obviously, beginning in one end, if you will, and then branching out. But the origins of the law system, obviously, we end up in the realm of philosophy, as far as I know, anyway. We don't have any data going back that far. But when you think about the ideas of the origins of the law structure, where do you track it back to? I mean, is it to Egypt? To say to Egypt is kind of generic, if you know what I mean, in one sense.
Well, that's right. Well, there's 2 points. There's law that is recognized as written, and then there's true law that is recognized as auricular or spoken law, which we see in terms of tribal law, cultural law, historical law, which itself has an unmistakable chain because we see it in word, we see it in phrase, we see it in ritual. So in the present world places form over substance, and therefore the present world places the skill of writing above the skill of ideas. So if it's in writing, that in itself is regarded as having merit, whether or not it's true or false. But the origin of law begins not with the writing of law, but in the design of law and the speaking of law. And so we now go back to the very earliest Anatolian cultures, pre-Bronze Age cultures that they've uncovered in northern or eastern Turkey, as well as northern Syria, and in particular famous places such as the city of Ebla. And people may not have heard of the city Ebla. I do mention in a few texts, there's actually a famous epic poem that has been developed called Libor Clan Glass, or Book of the Green Race, which speaks quite detailed about Ebla. There's a fact about Ebla in northern Syria that more than 3,500 years ago, so at least 2,000 years prior to this, or 1,500 years prior to the zenith of Rome, this city was a city of almost 500,000 people.
That's quite a bit for being that time.
It was an epicenter, and in fact, Ebla, or the writing of Eblate, which seems to be ground zero for the transition of law into writing, predates all other written Semitic languages. And Ebla is the source of all Semitic languages, whether it be Phoenician, whether it be Sumerian, whether it be any of those languages, whether it be Aramaic, Arabic, Hebrew, any of them, all ultimately originate from Ebla. Now, the other group that has a long provenance in terms of Europe, of course, is the Celt culture. And what we have forgotten, and what has been a terrible tragedy, is that very sophisticated cultures, including the Egyptians, considered the writing of law an abomination before the gods. The writing of law was an abomination because all law was spoken, our word was our bond, and to write was either to break the codes of initiation or to allow someone the opportunity to lie.
And that I think that's a really interesting point that you're making, because I remember a while back reading a little bit about Draco, or, the idea of where the draconian law come from. This was a lawgiver in ancient Greece, obviously, in I think it was 7th century or something like that, and he replaced, allegedly, the prevailing system of what you just mentioned, oral law, and also actually blood feud, but he replaced that with the written code, things that only could now be enforced by a court, and obviously today, because of the harshness of this law, we call some of the laws that are given draconian for that reason. But that's an interesting aspect, because that to me means that you've actually taken something that is belonging to the moral judgment of each individual, something in that sense that actually is pertaining to your heart. It's a spiritual matter when it comes to law, but he's now taken that out from that realm and placed it onto the dead world, if you will, of physical paper, right?
It is a dead form. All law today, and unfortunately people don't realize this, but all law today still honors the most ancient principle and has never deviated, that the law today is still spoken. It's not written, it's spoken. And that all this documentation and administration and streamlining and computerization is merely the trappings on presumption. The Roman system has never deviated from this principle because it can't. It can't deviate from this principle. And the reason it can't is, again, an insight in history that I think is very important for us to understand. The Yahudi, which we call the Israelites, these are the descendants of Akhenaten, we know as Moses. The Yahudi followed in the honor of their own heritage and their connection to the Celt world and the ancient world of having no written language to start with. Writing was considered an abomination. Hebrew is a modern language. Hebrew is not an ancient language brought back to life. Hebrew was created by the Menashe in northern Syria, who were based out of a place called Tarsus or Tartessus, the Greeks called. The Greeks called it hell. And the reason they called it hell was it was an epicenter of human sacrifice. And the Menashe, or we know as Menashe, are absolute dyed-in-the-wool Satan worshippers, demonic worshippers. And the Menashe were the ones that created Hebrew. And that wasn't created till the 4th century in response to Constantine's creation of imperial Christianity, the official religion of the new Holy Roman Empire by Constantine the Emperor. So the Yahudi themselves did not have a written language. In fact, Rome, Latin, the Romans didn't create that from scratch. The Romans were exiles of Yahudi. That's another secret that gets left out of the equation. The Romans stole a language created by a group called the Etruscans. There is screeds and screeds and screeds of Etruscan that they can't hide because it's been photographed, catalogued, and you hear this time and time again, no one can translate Etruscan. If you want to translate Etruscan, you get a mirror, you hold the mirror up to the words, and you find that the words have been mirror reversed, and it's called Latin. So the Yahudi exiles, when they conquered Italy, took the Etruscan language, broke their vows, and adopted their own written language, and they called it a cursive language. Surprise, surprise, cursive language, and they called it Latin.
And we've been telling that too with some of the guests in terms of the Etruscan influence, if you will, of the knowledge that the Roman later attained, that this basically was something that was stolen from them. The idea of some of the architectural feats, the aqueduct ideas, and I think it just goes on and on from there, basically.
The Roman Empire, being a great empire of engineering and high learning, is a complete myth. Complete and utter myth. What the Romans did is the Romans created a kingdom of ideas, and it was based on false ideas. They became fabricators of their own history and fabricators of their own greatness. And through that, they found a way to circumvent and to acquire other people's brilliance and claim it as their own. If you see some of the bronzes of the Etruscans, the Romans never, ever reached the same skill in bronze work as the Etruscans. Never. If you see some of the writing of cursive, just handwriting of the Latins and certainly of High, these guys were illiterate. I mean, they couldn't write to save themselves. No wonder they had to have it all done formally into buildings. Their handwork, compare that to Greek, to ancient Greek, and there is no comparison. I mean, ancient Greek, a language created by Aristotle, the tutor of Alexander the Great, in the rolling out of the Hellenic Empire, was itself the high point. And Rome stole most history from the Etruscans and the Greeks and from anyone else to claim. And really, they were just good at managing slaves. That was their real thing. Subjugating people, lying, and managing slaves. That's the Roman Empire.
Now, do you believe that because it seems to me when we look back into history that the ideas that the Roman came with then in that sense were almost foreign to all the other people and the tribes, the nations of that time, the different peoples.
Completely.
Because this was not something that was... it was like they were caught, offhand. What do you call it? They were completely surprised by this concept coming in because this seemed to not have existed before. Correct?
Well, exactly. I mean, let's take the concept of possession. Big issue when people lose their homes. Big issue when people have things taken from them. So let's take possession. Under the Celtic law, possession was considered an obligation of stewardship. One didn't simply possess the land in terms of claiming it to own it, one administered the land. one serviced the land, one protected the land, maintained it. And under the Roman system, what the Romans did, and this just shows you, this actually starts to expose the lies of history. The Romans were extraordinarily lazy. And under the Celtic system, it was invented that one had to survey the land and report back every few years, which we now call a census, but they called a survey. And actually the word survey actually comes from Gaelic. So they had to survey the land every few years and report back that the boundaries were clear, the metes and bounds, and that the land was in good order. Well, the Romans were lazy and they were greedy. So they came up with a concept they called occupation, or occupatio in Latin. And it came from their fascination of using ledgers. And so what they said was this: yes, land is, possession is 9/10 of the law, but there is 1/10. And without that 1/10, you don't truly have ownership. That 1/10 is called occupation. Now, if it's not in our register, you don't fully own it. And you can't get your name in that register unless you're a Roman citizen. And every few years, we will call on people to maintain the register. And yes, you possess the land, but you possess it purely with the right of what they call usufruct, from which we get a variation of use, which is you can take the fruits of the land, but you will never ultimately own it, because the Roman citizens now owned it by claiming it in a book. Now imagine this. It's contrary to the auricular law of most of the tribes, which considered writing an abomination. I mean, this is why the Vikings and the Danes were a sophisticated people that were able to discuss sophisticated concepts and proven by their extraordinary accuracy in terms of astronomy. These were not Stone Age people. These were not ignorant people, but they considered writing in honour of their Celtic roots an abomination. So you can imagine this whole concept to them wasn't just alien, but was, I mean, they probably would have, some of them would have laughed and said, you've got to be joking. But the Romans were deadly serious, and they went about reclaiming land or claiming land as provinces. And in those provinces, they put the senior role. History tells them as governors now. They were never governors. They were called rectors. And then against the rector was put a curator. And the curator was what they call the custos rotalorum, the keeper of the rolls. And those registers, which were called tabulae, and a record in a tabulae was called a name or a nomen. And on that would be your familia or your family, which is your slave household, that the household that you were the slave to a Roman citizen. And the Romans managed those. And there's a classic example of the lazy Romans stealing the world.
That's very interesting. Do you think that, is this where the idea of tax comes from as well then? Does that touch with this idea that basically it's a laziness, if you will, then of this particular system that want to live off of others, actually, of their, blood, sweat and tears in many cases.
Totally.
Yeah.
The Romans had a system, and what they, paying due to the Romans, they were lazy, there's no question. They were liars without doubt. Their culture is a complete sham. But one thing they did do, the Romans had an extraordinary register system, a public register system, which meant they could track anything in the empire. And that's how they controlled trade, commerce, manufacturing, and so on. And those registers were massive. When the Roman cult, being a faction within the Roman Catholic Church, the reason I use the word Roman cult is because I wanted to distinguish a handful of families who are Satan worshippers. Well, they used to be. They don't really worship anything now, but and they're completely insane now. They're mentally insane, inbred, and extremely dangerous people. They should be institutionalized, but they're not. They're in positions of power. But I wanted to distinguish that very small group from the more than billion plus good people who may subscribe to a belief system we know as the Catholic Church. But yeah, the Roman cult is a classic continuance of this system. But when the Roman cult destroyed the history to start again, I mean, it took years to burn all the records of the registers. I mean, there were millions and millions and millions of books of the Roman Empire all over the place.
And it seems also to me then that this is a cult that has, as you detailed before, being very, very efficient at taking, if you will, what was beneficial to them from other cultures. We have this idea that we try to pinpoint it to one, group, one people, one race, what have you. But as many people have been detailing, the Roman system, and you as well, they borrowed from the Etruscans. This is influences from the Venetians, the Khazarians. This goes on and on and on. And the system as such seemed to just absorb different people at different times and kind of merge those into the empire. Would you agree with that, Frank?
I would agree, but there are certain pivot points in history that if they had turned a different way, the world would be a very different place today. And those pivot points play an extraordinary point. Events in 1340 odd BCE still ripple through to the present day. Those events, those pivot points, have a large influence on the present ruling elite. I mean, you mentioned the Khazars, you mentioned the Venetians. The connections, particularly into the Khazarian Empire, plays an absolutely fundamental part in understanding the present world. In fact, if one wanted to understand what has been going on in this last 1,000 years, one would not be too far off if you viewed the world as being in a state of perpetual civil war between the various Khazarian diaspora, the various tribes of the great Khazarian Empire, still fighting for legitimacy well after the empire broke up.
What more can you say about that, and how do we see this today, do you think, playing out?
Well, I think there are a couple of things I think need to sort of lay out, and there is certainly more than enough anecdotal evidence to support this. But I think we need to talk about one pivot point first. I mentioned 1350 odd years ago. 1350 BCE, and the events I'm referring to is the decision by Pharaoh Akhenaten at the high point of the Ixos kingdom of Egypt to personally orchestrate the exodus of plague victims from the Egyptian cities to save Egypt, and that choice having an effect today. Akhenaten is the source of all the Moses myth, and in fact Akhenaten, without question, is the historic figure we know as Moses. The work by the Genome Project have totally unlocked the plague DNA and have made an accurate time date of the particular parasite back to the Nile River rat. And the origin of that disease is this period, 1340, 1350 BCE. What's significant is that when hundreds of thousands of Egyptians were sent into Sinai exile with Akhenaten, some thousands of them did not die. And they are the origin of another extraordinary genetic anomaly, which is also known in the Genome Project, but kept to the side, and most people don't hear of this. It's called the CCR5 anomaly. CCR5 anomaly. And what makes a CCR5 anomaly extraordinary is that if it is inherited by both parents, it renders the child immune to the bubonic plague. It renders the child immune to influenza. It renders the child immune to smallpox. And it appears that it also renders that child immune to another great killer called AIDS, HIV. So the descendants of Akhenaten carried with them a natural immunity to the plagues that destroyed and ravaged the world for the following millennia. Now, fast forward, and of course that group become the Yahudi, and I won't bore you with all the history that goes in between, but there's some key points in that history. But fast forward to the Yahudi being considered a supernatural race, having always a mystique, because other people die, they don't die, and then move them into a key period where the largest number of people with the CCR5 and the largest number, they've done the tracing of Akhenaten's genome, and the highest proportion of people that have his genetic material are found in Ireland, are found in Britain, are found in Northern Europe, and then are found in places like Khazar and Turkey in the Middle East. But the largest concentrations are, in fact, the British Isles and Northern Europe.
How about that? Well, this plays, yeah. Frank, I don't know if you heard that, but this kind of plays into the controversy a while back in terms of King Tut's DNA and the fact that this apparently was traced back to again, Northern European origins, and it's a dodgy area because this apparently was something that wasn't being released at first by I can't remember actually who it was who had the DNA, the data for this, but apparently this was something that was extracted or discovered by someone who saw the genome code in the background of this person talking about it, basically took a screen cap of that, turned it around or something like that, and actually decoded it from there and came up to the, what is it, the R, I'm forgetting that now, there's a specific there, but did you hear about the King Tut connection?
I'm aware of it, but I've written about this in a thing called Liber Clan Glass, Book of the Green Race, and the Book of the Green Race is that there was a priestly family, a priestly family that, just as the present ruling elite seek to collect power, this family collected religious bloodlines. And what they did was, over centuries, and in fact over millennia, folded in the most famous bloodlines into this family. And it is the source of the priest kings of the ancient world. And they were the most influential bloodline. And in fact, the present elite know this, and they have continued to use this class in ignorance to maintain their system. In fact, the system of the world would not exist today if this family had woken up and had actually started to do the right thing even 100, 200, 500, 1,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many, many of them. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them all around the world. But they come from Northern Europe, they come from the British Isles, and they were the Druids, the Druid family, the Holy. And they were wiped from history, and all their icons, all their traditions were stolen by this family of Khazars. But it all comes back to this gift, this godlike gift that allowed certain people to live while others died around them through plague. And you understand, without the technology to understand that this was a genetic anomaly, could you imagine how that would be perceived by people even, let's say, 1,600 years ago, in the greatest plagues of history, when around 450 to 550 at the time of Justinian, when more than 1 in 2 people died in the world. Over 120 million people died in a space of about 30, 40 years, and the entire world fell within 50 years into the Dark Ages.
Yeah. The perception here would be that I mean, God had put His grace directly onto these families or people who lived through this, and they were meant to, be the custodians of the whole thing after that, right?
Well, Justinian had completely rewritten the law, the Holy Law, and his specific goal was to destroy the Menashe and human sacrifice. He considered, and rightly so, that these satanic worshippers, these bad eggs that could trace their history back to the Yahudi, back to Akhenaten, were bad eggs. And he actually destroyed their kingdom. Their kingdom, which some have argued was actually called Israel. It was certainly in the structure of the kingdom, the 12 tribes, the 13th tribe being Reuben, the fact that the Menashe created the Talmud. I mean, they destroyed this kingdom and scattered them just as the plagues came in. And of course, the Menashe, being traders as well as being religious, sought refuge with their old trading buddies, the land pirates. And the land pirates, of course, are the Khazarian hordes. These are southern Mongolian hordes, and right up to the Black Sea, that were able to travel vast distances when the whole of Asia, right up to the Baltic Sea, were great grass plains, and they could travel back and forth. And this was the land pirates known as the Khazarians. So once those two met, the die was cast. They became what we know as the White Khazars, later called the White Russians, and the tribal leaders of the Black Khazars, they became the Black Khazars or the Black Russians. And the die was set for everything that's unfolded up until today.
Very interesting. Regarding this, the genetic anomaly then, have you looked into what the origins of this was? Is this natural? Was this just a fluke mutation that happened, or is there something else going on there? What do you think?
Well, I think it's a bit of all. I think it's a bit of all of that. But the genetic anomaly has the same provenance as the origin of the bubonic plague. It itself can be dated back to this time, and it dates back precisely to the Exodus and the Sinai, which is written so heavily in the Old Testament. And Moses is Akhenaten. I mean, there's no doubt historically that the Pharaoh Akhenaten is absolutely the historic religious figure we know as Moses. And in fact, his laws are still the source of the commandments. You can actually go and see the commandments of Moses. They are available. They're up there. The commandments of Akhenaten. It's just that they've been corrupted and hidden, but they've still kept them up there. You can still find them. And they have no bearing whatsoever to Leviticus, which are the laws of the religion of Mithraism, which was created by the Yahudi exiles in Babylon with their old Persian buddies around 500 BCE. I mean, that is another part of history that comes into play. And Mithraism has got nothing to do with the origins of Yahud. Nothing.
So I remember this aspect a while back that we detailed in terms of the basically it is a conspiracy, theory, if you will, then, but it makes sense. It has to do with how the Catholic Church basically created the Black Death by eradicating the common house cat. As we know, the cat goes back to the Egyptian era. They worshipped the cat. They had cats around them, in many of their cities and so forth as well. And I just wonder if there's a connection there, because the latest, if you will, then spurring of the bubonic plague came around after the fact that a lot of the witches were prosecuted around Europe. A lot of things that they were associated with in terms of the connection with the cat and all that led to the spreading of the bubonic plague through the rats, basically, that were running amok in the various European cities at the time. Now, do you think that has any connection to the Egyptian thing that you mentioned in terms of the rats that spread this plague down there as well?
Absolutely, but But it took enormous effort to kickstart the plagues into Europe. You go and look at a history book, you'll never hear of the greatest plague deaths in history around the time of 550, 540 BC. It is CE, I should say. But you'll hear all these stories of the Black Death sweeping Europe. But it took enormous effort by the Catholic Church to create the conditions suitable for the spreading of the bubonic plague. Because the bubonic plague had largely run its course. And you've got to remember that in Europe, most people were largely immune. I mean, the immunity, the Celt tribes of what was called the Franks and Anglo-Saxon, getting up to the northern Europe, were firmly agrarian, well-organised, well-structured. They may have lost a fair amount of their technology because of the Roman cult and other groups, but they were persistent cultures that were rooted in common sense, and it took many efforts to promote. Now, if you go and look at sweeping plague, sure, there was evidence of the plague still live and well in the Middle East and in cities that were hopelessly administered. But in Europe, that was village, town, that was fields, that was common land, all of this. You did not have the conditions suitable for the promotion of the plague, let alone the fact that a fair number of the population were immune.
So why don't we go back a little bit to this idea you mentioned before in terms of the some of the inbred families, the satanic potential worship of by them as well, then, because this is something that is difficult to detail in terms of what the philosophies are and why they're doing certain things that they are and why the world has ended up in the place that it has. And it seems a very misanthropic, anti-human tendencies have been there from day one, pretty much, that this is a fight against human nature, against human spirituality, against the human spirit and the soul, right?
Yes. Well, there was a history that dates back to a city called Ur. And the city Ur worshipped a feminine goddess and worshipped through a symbol they called the Nub, or the Ub. And that symbol is what we call the pentagram. And the goddess they worshipped was Namu, later called Isis, later called Venus, later called Luciferia, later called Saturnia, which was the first name of Rome, the feminine. Of course, in this world, we'll call it the satanic being masculine, but in reality, and this is an opening, in fact, they give you a clue now. The modern Satanists occasionally whisper the word Lilith to give you an indication of the worship of the feminine darkness. But anyway, this city had an infamous history, and they were persistent in continuing their magic, which was that we have two souls. We have a true soul and a counterfeit soul, and that one can reach enlightenment through the counterfeit soul, and they worship the demons that they believe created us through the worship of the counterfeit soul. So these guys got kicked out, and they created a new city called Mari, and became a thing called the Amuru, or the Amarites. And then they got kicked out again, and they split up again, and they moved to a new city called Tarsar, or Tarsus, where we get Paul. That's where Paul comes from. He was a high priest of the Menashe. And of course, the Menashe are the descendants. Now, the Menashe wrote a book, and they made an oath, and it was an extraordinary concept, an unprecedented concept. In reaction to Constantine, they wrote an oath. They called it the Blood Oath, or the Covenant of the Chosen People. And what they did was there was a covenant between their god Sabaoth, or Sabbath, or Sabbat, from which we get the concept of Sabbath. Mm. And the promise was that they would reign on earth, and Sabaoth being the legion, the head of the legion of demons, would rule in the other world, and that it was a contract that they would fulfill, and that at the end of days, when the tribes returned, they would have their land granted. But their land would only be granted when there was a sacrifice of 6. There was no mention in the Talmud ever of minion, just a sacrifice of 6. After the tribulation of Daniel, or Daniel, which is the tribulation that some interpret as 3.5 years, and others have interpreted as 1260 years, or again, so that is their most key belief. So there was a series of prophecies. Now, all those prophecies were artificially created by the same ruling elite when they created the end of the world from 1941 to 1945. The banking families arbitrarily ended their covenant with Sabaoth, destroyed the blood covenant, and therefore destroyed their supernatural claim in 1945. They were comfortable now to rule as gods.
After the Second World War, so this is part of the plan, you're saying?
Well, key part of the plan of the Second World War was to fulfill all the major prophecies. You've got to remember, they could not legitimately move to their homeland and reclaim it until the promise with Sabaoth, who we know as Satan, or feminine Satan, until this was fulfilled. And that's what they did. And it's a clockwork. 6 million. They tried it at the turn of the century in World War I, and it failed. So they did it slightly differently. And what they accomplished was, between the Khazarian tribes, they managed to wipe out the Magyars, managed to wipe out some of their major competitors in the Bulgar descendants of the Khazars, by basically stealing their identities. And certainly in Russia, they pretty much wiped out the Rusar, who were the main tribe of the Khazars, who had the first legitimate right. This is the Russian Orthodox. And they eliminated them so that the Magyar, which was a sub-branch, which settled in a place called, they named Anatoy, which later was called Venice. So the Venetians were the winners, and they basically stole their identities, and they used the Vatican to forge, I think the Vatican admits that they forged something like 80,000 new identities, of which I think something like 50,000 of them were rabbi.
Really?
No one ever asks what happened to their flocks.
When was this again?
World War II.
Interesting. So we're talking about the creation of Israel here, obviously. This is tied into it. We were talking about the consequence of the world wars, the transfer agreement, all of that stuff. If we go back...
The Talmud's black and white. Either the covenant that is the underpinning of the Talmud has been fulfilled, and therefore Israel is legitimate, or the Talmud is still in operation, and Israel and everyone that supports it is an abomination to their God. It's one of the two. There's no middle ground.
And is this because I'm not familiar with this, is this a concept that is contained within the Talmud?
Absolutely. All the rabbi in the world know this. Either the Talmud is finished and there is no Jewish faith anymore. The Jewish faith doesn't exist. It's gone. It's over. Finished. And Israel is legitimate. And what we're seeing is a show. It's a song and dance. It doesn't exist anymore. And that's why the rabbi are free to do what they like. Or the Talmud is still in operation, and Israel is the greatest abomination in the history of the Jewish faith, and anyone that supports it is an absolute heretic.
So we're talking about in a way the fake or fraudulent fulfillment of the prophecies, if you will, then coming out of the Judaic Christian tradition, or the real story, and if the actuality this has played out. Where are you on this?
Well, I don't believe the rabbi in the world would risk continuing in an offensive way. I believe that they all pretty much accepted those that, are worthy of being called a rabbi, knowing that the Jewish faith ended in World War II and that the covenant's fulfilled, and the Talmud is a nice historic document, has no value whatsoever now. And what we're living under is a thing called the New World Order.
Oh, yeah. That is for sure. And so the question is where we are in that sense on this page then, because if certain of these tribes have, well, in one sense, from my point of view anyway, played the game, even if it's, well, it's still within the realm of prophecies, ideas that come from another realm interpreted by man, and that these different groups have different purposes to fulfill, if you will, on the earth. And when certain things have played out, the certain rules and laws are not applicable anymore. So to me, it's all within the artificial construct. These are all just ideas, if you will. But from their point of view, Frank, where are we now then in the game plan, if you will? Seems like all bets are off, right?
Well, right now, remembering that the group that won out, the Magyar, who created the concept of enetoi, which they called as meaning praiseworthy, chosen, and later became Venice. The Magyar were largely black Khazars, whereas the Rusar, the Russians, who separated after the 9th century under first Grand Prince of Rusar, Aaron or Rurik, they are the legitimate inheritors of the Menashe claim. So these people that basically took over the world aren't even Semitic. They don't herald from the Middle East. You can never be accused of being anti-Semitic, ever. They come from southern Mongolia. And where we're at the moment is, since World War II, when they trashed their covenant, and their leaders knew that they trashed their covenant and ended the Jewish faith. The Jewish faith does not exist anymore. They destroyed it. We have seen a systematic dumbing down of the ruling elite to the point now that not only can't they do up their own shoelaces, not only can they not even get out the door without someone helping them, but they are clinically and actually insane. They have become so isolated that they, and indeed the people that they select to rule the world on their behalf in public, are psychopaths. I mean, incompetent psychopaths. And the world has never been in a more dangerous place because the world is ruled by idiots.
It certainly seems like it. It's, yeah, I go back and forth on that all the time. Certain things seem brilliant, the way that they are, conducted, if you will. And this, from my current belief anyways, that this is some things that are happening behind the scenes. The people behind the throne, the real power, if you will, behind the throne. And then what we're given, just as you say, are these kind of moronic people, and that kind of creates a dissonance for people as well. When we have people like, George Bush and Tony Blair and some of these people who are incapable of talking right, and they seem to even lack the basic awareness that they have, and this includes many of the kings and queens that we see as well, totally gone.
They're all morons.
Yeah,
they're all morons. But this is really, really important. This is really, really important. Yes, there was absolute brilliance built into the present system, which we call democracy, demos kratos. Many ways to split that up, but let's say common law, communists, to commit to servitude. That's ultimately what communist means, to commit to servitude, voluntary slavery. The brilliance behind that, the Jesuits were an absolute shining light. But if you just take them off the battlefield for the moment, we are dealing completely today with morons. This needs to be understood. There is no brilliance in what they're doing. Look, they want to bring back gold standard. There's no one should have any doubts about that. They want to restart their system, but you are seeing them flounder because they don't even know how it works. That's how stupid they are now. They don't even know how their own worshipped automated system works anymore. They don't know about the law. They don't know about finance. They don't know where they come from. They don't know the tricks. They don't know the rituals. They don't believe it. The only thing they believe in is that they were born into this and that's who they are. That's all they know.
How did that go so quick then? Because 1945, we're only talking about, what, 60, 70 years now? Approximately. And that's, what is that? That's like 2 generations of rulership, potentially 35 each, here. So, is this genetically, driven? Is it just that they placed people in power? Because what I'm seeing in a way is still the continuation of the bloodline. If we look at the kings and the queens and,
sure.
And same thing goes as we've detailed now, in terms of many of the presidential candidates and presidents of the United States. They are bloodline, part of the bloodline. They're in there as well, right? So what has happened?
While your family and my family, although, as I mentioned, my family have been relatively comfortable, but let's take the average family. While the average family has struggled to survive, parents have worked till 65, the father might die soon after, the mother struggles, the family struggles, people struggle. They might be comfortable with bits and pieces and consumer goods, but they certainly don't have a 300-foot yacht. They don't have 30 homes. They don't have access all areas. So whilst the world have been voluntary slaves, with their sweat, blood and tears being drained from them, the ruling elite has had an open check since 1945. They don't live in ghettos anymore, although they do, if you talk about walled communities, they kind of live in ghettos, but they're certainly a far cry from the ghettos that their culture forced them to live in order to maintain a lie. They have had everything laid out for them. They can do whatever they like. They can start whatever war they like. They can build bigger and bigger ships. They can go on perpetual holidays. They can buy and sell sports teams. And if you take that, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Power may corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And they ended it. They started the New World Order, and they had one plan and one plan only, to maintain control. And that's not good enough. Every generation prior to that had a plan to do something. These guys have had one plan and one plan only, to maintain control and to keep lying. And that's not good enough. And their system, because they haven't trained enough people to maintain it, and the fact they don't even... People be astounded to know that there are whole divisions of the world of high finance that have no idea how the global financial system actually works at its root. I don't mean the stuff they put in the Financial Times. I mean actually from a ritual, historical, structural position in terms of trust law, in terms of currency, minting, money, bonds, underwriting. They have no idea of the art of the scrivener. That is completely ignorant to them now.
Frank, let's continue on that note. There's more, obviously, I want to talk with you about there in terms of basically where we're going now, and in one sense, the rudderless plan basically that is going here, and what some of the consequences of that is going to be, and it's. Although we're covering obviously a huge area here, we're just kind of topically going through history, talking about some of the various groups and so forth. We'll see if we can specialize a little bit more in some of the aspects here in the second hour. But before we do that, Frank, we definitely want to give out your websites. We want to alert people to where they can find more information about your work, about the things that you're doing, and about everything else there. You have a couple of websites out there, quite a few actually. UCADIA.com that I mentioned before, but then you've started up quite a bit of the what should we call them, the one series of websites. Tell us about this.
Yeah, there's a few there. Look, we'll just give a couple. I mean, UCADIA, UCADIA.com, and the other one that I would say just to start with is One Heaven. So that's one-heaven.org, or just one heaven as one word.org. will get you to another key site. And that site I want to give because there is a historic project on that. It has to do with rewriting canon law, which hopefully we can talk about.
Absolutely. There's so much more to discuss, and I want to go into the law system aspect of this a little bit more, and basically see talk about some of the solutions, I guess, in that sense, that you have to this and the way to combat the law system, because what we're seeing throughout history is basically people being ruled and run by a system which they don't have any control over. Things have been run by, if you will, then them for such a long time, and basically. Yes. All we're trying to detail here, obviously, is the problems, so that